This is what a battle between feudal Japanese armies of the Sengoku Jidai would have looked like. It is a quite alien sight for audiences used to the blocky formations of modern strategy games like Total War or the free-for-all style engagements of Hollywood films. And yet, the model seen here does a far better job of bringing to life the nuances found on contemporary Japanese screen paintings which depict such armies in battle. Delving into its details will therefore do much to allow us to better understand the actual nature of militaries of this era. From the structure of a daimyo's military organization to a clan's system of recruitment, its unit types, its banner systems, its headquarters, its army formations, and more. This is the true size of a samurai army of the Sengoku Jidai.
It's been a blast researching and eventually constructing an army of the Sengoku Jidai, and I hope you guys appreciate and learn from this reconstruction. But you can set foot in the setting for yourself with Assassin's Creed Shadows. Thanks to Ubisoft for sponsoring this video. For me, the Assassin's Creed series has been a dream come true when it comes to basically transporting yourself into the past and exploring it in person. For a long time now, we've actually been using Discovery Mode to provide historical tours of places like the Library of Alexandria, the Parthenon in Athens, and the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. And AC Shadows promises to provide an equally engaging and faithful rendition of feudal Japan. To this end, the game has leveraged historians and experts to craft an authentic world, from cities and castles to civilians and soldiers. This includes interacting with great historical figures like Oda Nobunaga and Akechi Mitsuhide as they take part in the epic unification of Japan. You'll experience this action through a main storyline with dual protagonists, a shinobi assassin and a legendary samurai. Each offers a unique perspective and gameplay style. To learn more, check out the Assassin's Creed trailer for yourself and pre-order the game on Xbox or PlayStation 5. Enjoy!
This episode is set in the late 1500s, during the period of the Sengoku Jidai, when the disparate warlords of Japan sought to consolidate their power in a growing struggle to seize ultimate control of the land. But the seeds for this conflict were planted long ago, and will be worth briefly reviewing for context. In the 8th century AD, the Heian period had enjoyed a prolonged period of peace. Such stability saw its large conscripted armies replaced by mercenary troops meant to take on smaller scopes of policing and emergency response. The creation of these forces led to the rise of the bushi, whom we in the West know as samurai. By the mid-10th century, the maturation of private military recruiting networks led by local leaders greatly reshaped Japan. This decentralization gave way to an era wherein power was organized along the relationships between lords, vassals, and fiefs. It was here that the samurai began to emerge as a distinct social caste. By the late 12th century, the samurai came to control many important aspects of government. A century later, the turmoil of Mongol invasions and civil wars saw the strength of the imperial court erode ever further. This in turn allowed the local lords, known as daimyos, to fill the vacuum, gaining important judicial and economic powers on top of the military ones they had already possessed. These figures competed with one another, often violently, culminating in the simultaneous outbreak of a succession crisis with many major clans and the shogun's family in the late 15th century. The separate struggles, exacerbated by famine, finally culminated in a general state of civil war known as the Sengoku Jidai. It is the armies of this era which we shall seek to model. Yet, given the decentralized and rapidly shifting nature of the period, It is impossible to present a one-size-fits-all description. We will therefore attempt to present you with some broader trends while increasingly narrowing our focus to the point that a singular army can eventually be fielded. For starters, we can consider a typical daimyo's military organization, or Kashindan. At the top of the structure would have been the ruling lord himself. Directly beneath him was the ichimon, or first group of vassals, which consisted of blood relatives and trusted hereditary retainers. Such high-ranking men sat on the Lord's Council, held top administrative positions, managed castles, and commanded major military units. Beneath these men would be additional layers of major and minor vassals. Most would have been kunishu, or landed gentry, who were organized into regional groups. Others would have been the shinzanshu, or new people who hailed from outer territories, recent conquests, or semi-independent allies. All such men were of the samurai caste, often receiving land and/or payments from their lord so as to afford their gear and to employ personal retainers. At the lowest levels of the organization were the members of the general population, including rural samurai and villagers who would be called up for war in a variety of ways. Let us now briefly cover these methods of recruitment. In days past, systems of mass conscription had been used. Though mandatory registration did still exist in some form, it was now generally the case that military mobilization was more selectively based on the assessed production of one's cho, or land. This was measured in terms of koku, or roughly 150 kilograms of rice, which was enough to feed a man for a year. It is this latter system which proved more dominant and was ultimately standardized in the ensuing Edo period. During the Sengoku era, the exact ratio of troops to koku would have varied. But we can get some indication of the scale we are talking about here by turning to the 1581 mobilization records of Akechi Metsuhide, who required 6 men for every 100 koku. Here is the data which lists contributions up to 1,000 koku. Regulations from the Edo period, about 50 years later, give us a better sense of scale for even higher levels. To pick a few data points, a vassal with 1,000 koku brings 23 men. 5,000 koku brings 102 men. 10,000 koku brings 235 men. And 100,000 koku brings 2,155 men. The general trend is that the richer the vassal, the higher the percentage of guns, mounted men, and support staff he is supposed to bring. As can be seen in these lists, there were a variety of troop types being mobilized. Let us review these now. Here, distinctions can be made in terms of class and weapon type. Starting with class, we have the samurai and the non-samurai. The former were wealthier members of the hereditary military nobility who were well armed, well trained, and often mounted. The latter, meanwhile, were either warrior servants who fought as light foot soldiers, known as Ashigaru, or were peasants who served as non-combatant porters. The Ashigaru were generally less well equipped and trained than their elite peers, though this gap was noticeably reduced by the later years of the Sengoku era. The other means of classifying troop types was by their weapon. Spears, such as the roughly 2-meter yari, appear to have been most commonly used by both samurai and Ashigaru troops. A variant, the nagara yari, actually extended its length out over 5 meters and was an increasingly popular tool of specialized Ashigaru units. Swords, meanwhile, were also quite ubiquitous, though these tended to serve as secondary weapons. Contrary to popular belief, battle depictions of the era indicate that both samurai and Ashigaru could have worn paired swords. This included both a long and a short version, such as the katana and wakizashi, though higher-end models were more likely to be found among the samurai class. In terms of ranged weapons, the Yumi longbow was most commonly fielded by both foot and horse archers of both classes. Its more modern counterpart was the teppon, or matchlock arquebus, which came in a variety of calibers and was also wielded by both samurai and Ashigaru alike. However, the latter seem to have been more likely to have been granted this new technology as it greatly improved their battlefield effectiveness, allowing daimyos to quickly mobilize ever larger swathes of their populations. Now let's see how these basic troop types were grouped together and assigned to their officers. The first thing to note is that while soldiers may have mustered under a particular leader, according to the Koku system we previously described, they were often reorganized under a new structure when it came time to actually form an army. The exact system being used varied widely by time and place. For our episode today, we will be assuming an idealized model which captures some of the broad trends of the era. As a quick guide, an army can be roughly broken up into groups similar to modern systems of squads, platoons, companies, and battalions. In the case of feudal Japan, the equivalent would have been the Go, the Kumi, and the Sonae, whose variants spanned the functions of a company or battalion. Again, however, please note that these names and these groupings were not universal for all armies. For the most part, Ashigaru troops made up the bulk of these forces, with samurai serving as their officers. This was especially true in later years, when clans fielded increasingly large and professionalized forces. While there were still concentrated units of samurai infantry and cavalry, these were diluted and often even outnumbered by accompanying Ashigaru retainers. With this overview in mind, let's reconstruct a feudal Japanese army in true size. The smallest unit would have been that of a squad-sized Go of about 5 to 10 men, led by a Kogashira, or small leader. Most were senior Ashigaru, who functioned as corporals, though some clans, such as the Takeda, appear to have occasionally filled this position with a junior samurai. To designate this officer's rank, we have chosen to depict them with slightly more decorated armor and, for melee squads, a sashimono banner featuring relevant colors and coats of arms. Spear and pike Ashigaru Go may have tended to feature a higher soldier-to-officer ratio given the relative abundance of this basic troop type, but for the sake of simplicity, we have assumed 5 men for our one Kogashira. Archer and gun Ashigaru Go, on the other hand, are quite regularly seen to have 5 men for every Kogashira. Such ranged squads may have been composed of all archers, all gunners, or a mix of the two. In earlier times, the pure archer units would have been more prevalent. As guns became more readily available, though, entire squads might have been armed with them. However, it was found that a proper balance of the two was best. After all, while guns were theoretically deadlier, they had long reloading times. Thus, the faster shooting archers were actually quite useful in providing cover fire and rounding out the tactical flexibilities of the team. In such squads, the Kogashira would have been expected to not just command the men, but also to assist them in their duties. For instance, special batons would have been used to gauge distances and determine the right time to shoot. Officers also carried ammunition with them, which was to be distributed to the men in combat. An archer kogashira might be hauling bundles of anywhere from 50 to 100 arrows. A gunner kogashira, meanwhile, carried extra ramrods, spare munitions, and a bundle of burning fuses wrapped around his arm, which could be used to quickly replace those of his subordinates which may have burned out. When it comes to samurai go, their definition will prove a bit more difficult. As previously mentioned, samurai were commonly dispersed across an army as the officers of Ashigaru units. In the cases where they did pull together into more elite units, this appears to have been done with even less standardization than their Ashigaru peers. For our model, we will assume that a samurai go is composed of one samurai and several foot soldier retainers. The samurai serves as the squad leader, proudly bearing a personalized sashimono banner, meant to rally his men and allow higher-ups to easily identify him in combat for post-battle rewards. Wealthier samurai could afford to ride a horse to battle and were accompanied by around 4 followers. Such men were either rural samurai or Ashigaru who may have sported swords, spears, polearms, bows, and even guns. We will assume the standard team manifests as 2 spearmen, 1 archer, and 1 gunner. Poorer samurai, on the other hand, went to war on foot and likely only had 1 to 2 followers with more basic weapons, such as a spear. At the next level, several Ashigaru Go came together to form a platoon-sized Kumi of about 10 to 30 men led by a Kumi Gashira. In our case, the spear Ashigaru Kumi has been assumed to feature just 2 Go for a total of 10 soldiers and 2 Kogashira officers, while the pike Ashigaru Kumi, with whom they were often grouped, has been assumed to have 3 Go for a total of 15 soldiers and 3 Kogashira. The ranged Ashigaru Kumi, meanwhile, follow the more common tradition of having 5 Go for a total of 25 soldiers and 5 Kogashira officers. As before, these feature a mix of bow and gun-armed Ashigaru, either in their own squads or mixed together. Zooming in to one of the Kumi command units, we see it is led by a samurai officer. Most would have held the title of Kumi Gashira, though some specialized units, such as the pike Ashigaru, may have been led by higher-ranking Bugyo. Given their status, such officers would have been mounted, worn better gear, and donned a sashimono banner with more personalized details. They also would have brought with them their own retainers. In this case, we have assumed a group of 5 retainers, which included soldiers, squires, and bannermen. Likely in the same manner as the Ashigaru, several samurai go rolled up into a platoon-size samurai Kumi, led by a senior officer whose title we have kept generic as a Kumi Gashira. As with the samurai go, we have modeled both cavalry and infantry units, though again, this has more to do with their wealth and access to horses than a fixed battlefield role. To generalize, our cavalry samurai Kumi will feature 10 of our previously defined go for a total of 10 samurai, one of whom act as Kumi Gashira, and 40 retainers, of which 20 are spearmen, 10 are archers, and 10 are gunners. An odd composition for a cavalry unit, yet ultimately a practical one, given the relative lack of horses in Japanese warfare at the time. The idea was that such samurai riders often dismounted for battle, joining their retainers on foot to form a mixed infantry formation. When they did ride into combat, the retainers would run after their masters to screen their operations or to engage in combat. While this may have limited some of the mobility of such forces, it greatly increased their tactical flexibility. Our samurai infantry Kumi will be assumed to field more go about 15, owing to the greater pool of men which inhabited this lower tier of the economic pyramid. However, for the resulting 15 samurai, they bring with them only 25 total retainers, all of whom we assume are spearmen. This makes for an overall smaller and less diverse Kumi than their richer cavalry peers. At the next level, several Kumi units would have been grouped into a company or battalion-sized force known as a Sonae. These were led by a Taisho, or even the Daimyo himself, in the case of HQ units. Their size and composition varied greatly. In terms of size, this ranged anywhere from a few hundred to upwards of 1,000, though the typical strength seems to have been around 700. In terms of composition, Sonae usually acted as tactical units which hosted a combined arms force of skirmishers, infantry, and cavalry. In addition, these were reinforced by a command unit, a banner unit, and a baggage train. Military theory of the later Edo period provides some specifics in terms of what may have been considered more or less standard. For instance, a 50 Kisonae was based around the idea of deploying a corps of 50 cavalrymen, around which was wrapped the other elements. Adapting the text slightly to match our prior definitions yields the following combat units: 2 Ashigaru Skirmisher Kumi, 2 Ashigaru Spear Kumi, 2 Ashigaru Pike Kumi, 5 Samurai Cavalry Kumi, 2 Samurai Infantry Kumi. As a quick side note, the 6 Ashigaru units would likely have been raised by the Taisho himself, while the remaining samurai units were his vassals who had raised their own troops. Altogether, these added up to about 150 skirmishers, 286 melee infantry, and 50 cavalry, for a total of 486 soldiers. Now, however, we must add the command, banner, and baggage units. The command group could be quite elaborate for great lords, but in our case we will assume that it is a more modest version befitting a vassal whose Sonae is but one part of a larger army. In such a case, it would have been led by a Taisho, who was often seated on a stool to manage his force. His horses and grooms were located nearby in case the need arose to remobilize. Directly beside the Taisho were 10 or so trusted vassals and staff officers meant to offer advice, confer status, and act as bodyguards in case of emergencies. Among them might be a few honored valets who were young samurai in training. Close at hand were several Ashigaru signalers. These used instruments such as bells, drums, and conch trumpets to transmit orders, raise morale, or mark the time. Smoke signals and whistling arrows are even attested to as means of communication. Near them might also be found important messengers known as the Tsukai Ban. In keeping with the Edo period records, we will assume 4 of these are present, each with a handful of followers. Such mounted samurai were greatly honored for their loyalty, bravery, and efficiency in quickly relaying communication across the battlefield. To identify these men from a distance and to prevent friendly fire, they often donned unique gear such as this vibrant red horo cloak, which inflated in the wind. A few other miscellaneous members of the command group which were likely to have been on call for the Taisho included pages, scribes, priests, and doctors. Finally, we must mention the Metsuke. Such men were typically agents of the overall army's ruling daimyo, who policed and supervised his vassals. Importantly, the Metsuke would report on the performance of units and individuals for post-battle rewards. Such matters were taken quite seriously, and investigations with court proceedings were not unheard of as means to ascertain the true chain of events leading to claims of bravery or cowardice. As a result, we have chosen to assign the Metsuke 2 retainers for assistance in his duties. The next major element which made up the Sonae was the Hatagumi, or banner group, composed of about 15 Ashigaru, under the command of a Hatagugyo. Most of its members would have carried large rectangular banners known as Nobori no Hata. These were used as signals between Sonae through the synchronized raising, lowering, and waving of the flags. 2 smaller groups of men, meanwhile, were tasked with upholding the Uma Jirushi, which was a large standard bearing the personal identifiers of the commanding taisho. Its purpose was to orient the entire force, raise morale, and, most importantly, to make clear the presence of a powerful man, both on the march and in battle. The sheer quantity and ubiquity of such banner units in feudal Japanese armies should be an important indication of both their military and cultural importance. The last major element of the Sonae was the konida, or baggage train, led by a konida bugyo. Its purpose was to handle the logistical needs of the battle group. For the most part, this meant carrying food, drink, weapons, and armor, materials for construction, repairs, siegecraft, wound care, hygiene, cooking, entertainment, and personal use could also be found. One very common item would have been general-purpose wooden boards, used interchangeably as flooring, roofing, tables, barricades, and battlefield cover. Carrying all of this would have been porters and pack animals with drivers. For our model, we can once more lean on the Edo manuals to assume that it consists of 150 porters, 15 pack horses, and 15 drivers employed by the various samurai, in addition to the taisho's own 20 porters, 5 pack horses, and 5 drivers. While civilian non-combatants made up a large percentage of the baggage train, it should be noted that this unit was often subject to tight military oversight, which limited the presence of non-essential camp followers that might otherwise threaten to slow down and bloat an army on campaign. With all the parts of the 50 Kisonae now combined, we can review its total composition. Roughly 90% of the beings here are human, and 10% are animals. Slicing by class, we can see that 14% are samurai and 86% are non-samurai. Further breaking things down by combat role, we see that about 26% are peasant non-combatants, 20% are skirmisher Ashigaru, 40% are melee Ashigaru, 3% are samurai officers, 4% are samurai infantry, and 7% are samurai cavalry. Yet such figures should be taken with a grain of salt, as they represent an approximation of just one recorded incarnation of a Sonae. Such units, after all, could feature all kinds of troop mixtures to meet the needs of a given campaign. Some had more Ashigaru, while others had more samurai. Eastern Sonae featured more cavalry, while Western Sonae featured more guns. There simply was no standard. For additional context, we can now deploy our Sonae into one of the more common battle formations described in warfare manuals of the roughly contemporary Edo period. Here we see the force drawn up in a series of layers. In the outermost layer lie 2 Kumi units of archers and gunners, whose job it will be to skirmish with the enemy. In such a capacity, they may have been accompanied by tate or pavis-style shields and other deployable emplacements. Once combat was to begin, manuals recommended that gunners should start shooting at 110 meters, while archers loosed at 55 meters. With alternating volleys, these ranged units would weaken a defensive position or disrupt an oncoming assault. If such skirmishing dragged on, porters helped keep them resupplied. But should these front ranks face too much pressure, they would fall back to the second rank. Here were deployed 2 spear and 2 pike Ashigaru Kumi in a roughly 80-strong long line, just 1 or 2 men deep. Their job was to halt an assault. Against infantry, the pikes may have been raised high into the air and dropped down upon enemy troops for increased impact. Otherwise, pikes were simply held out in front of the soldier to stab at or fence with opposing troops. When facing cavalry, the pikemen apparently knelt down, planted their weapons into the ground, and raised their head to a horse's chest height, effectively turning their position into a static barricade. Behind them awaited the third rank, composed of 2 samurai infantry kumi. These roughly 80 men would be used to help shore up a faltering defense or help a promising attack break through. While the samurai were keen to sally out and gain glory, good officers kept them on a tight leash to properly time their engagement. Behind these 3 layers would be the commanding taisho. He helped direct the flow of battle using messengers, bannermen, and signalers. Of critical importance would be the deployment of 5 samurai cavalry kumi, which surrounded him as both bodyguards and reserves. At 250 men strong, they constituted a considerable pool of manpower. To enable their fast deployment, each unit stood at the ready in marching order facing the enemy. The mixed soldiers of each kumi would have already prearranged themselves into files of skirmishers, ashigaru, and dismounted samurai. As such, they were ready to fight in miniature versions of the front 3 ranks we previously described. Should the situation call for it, the dismounted samurai could quickly rush to their nearby horses, remount, and ride out. While these cavalry kumi may have been sent out to assist in skirmishing during the opening stages of a fight, it was more common to keep them as reserves to deliver shock assaults on weak parts of an enemy line, to intercept opposing cavalry, or to run down retreating units. Thus we see how a Sonae could function as an army in miniature, ready to operate on its own in a highly dynamic manner akin to Napoleon's future army corps system. This appears to have been a reflection of the rugged terrain of Japan, which favored the use of small, mobile forces. When entire armies assembled, they would have done so by fielding multiple Sonae. Here we have deployed 8 such units for a roughly 6,000 strong force. Manuals seem to indicate that these Sonae would often have been deployed in a checkerboard pattern. The front units acted as the vanguard, followed by the middle guard, flank guards, and rear guards who protected the consolidated baggage train. At the center of the army, likely atop high ground, would have been the overall commander's Sonae, known as the Honjin. It would have been the largest of the army contingents, with many household units composed of hatamoto, or direct vassals of the daimyo. At its heart lay the jinmaku, or camp curtains, which helped reduce wind and provide privacy for the daimyo and his entourage. Around him was arranged an even larger command unit with all manner of important-sounding positions and protocols to follow. Also of note would have been the Lord's own personal banner and overall army flag known as the O-Umojirushi. Such items were of extreme significance, in the same manner as Roman legionary eagles. Protecting them came at all costs, and to seize one from the enemy was a huge mark of pride. Looking across the battlefield, we can observe how the daimyo's central position allowed him to quickly interpret the visual and audio communications being sent from his sub-commanders across the field. This attests to a far higher level of command and control for the armies of this era than most people give them credit for. But studies of these systems and tactics shall have to be covered another time. For now, we hope you have appreciated this deep dive into the true size of a samurai army's organization. Each and every episode is a labor of love which takes countless hours of work to produce. Ad revenue is never reliable, and if you want to ensure that we can keep making these episodes, please consider supporting us directly on Patreon or YouTube memberships. A big thanks to the current fans who support the channel, and a special shout out to the researchers, writers, and artists for making this episode. We couldn't have done it without this team and this community. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to like and subscribe for more content and check out these other related videos. See you in the next one.